Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar hosted by Tonic Media Network and with the help of Claire Hayes as the producer. An important moment in this COVID pandemic. Before I go any further, my name is Norman Swan. I'm a co-founder of Tonic Media Network, but also I work at the ABC, I suppose is really what I do. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge country. I think everybody who is on this panel is speaking from Gadigal country, part of the Eora Nation. And we'd all like to pay our respects to past elders, present elders, most important of all, future elders. And what I will say as part of that acknowledgement of country and part of this COVID pandemic that we're going through is what we've seen in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities is the proof of the power of community control. We're seeing issues around community control in Southwest Sydney at the moment. We saw it last year in the second wave in non-Aboriginal communities. But what happened in Aboriginal communities is the federal government got out of the way of Aboriginal communities and allowed them to exert control over their own communities, to control the pandemic and control the risk to their community. And they've done that magnificently. Often acknowledgement of country has a sort of token feel to it, and there's nothing token about the response of Aboriginal communities to the COVID-19 pandemic. So welcome to this webinar, which is looking forward. We've been doing it tough. We've not been doing it as tough as other countries, but we're thinking about you in Melbourne, where you're going through your 5th lockdown. Sydney's only going through its 2nd lockdown. And the virus is spreading in other parts of the country. And it takes its psychological toll, but it takes its toll on all of us, particularly people who are trying to market, and socially market and do the right thing. And brands having their problems too. Should they just go dark while all this is going on? Should they market through it? What's the sentiment of the community? It changes day by day. And we'll hear about some of those things in a moment. We've got a great panel for you. To ask a question or make a comment, go to the Q&A box and put your questions and comments in there, and we'll get to them as we go. I won't just wait till the end. I'll look at what you're doing and saying and bring you in as we go. There's lots of you online. Our panel today includes Simon Friedlander, who's creative director of Pereira O'Dell. He's been working remotely from their San Francisco office and helped to design the US vaccine ad program. We've got Professor Julie Leask from the University of Sydney. Julie is an authority, in fact, an international authority on risk perception, and particularly on as it relates to vaccines and vaccination, and has published well over 150 papers on various topics and well respected in her field, and understands the community sentiment and the science behind it. And last and certainly not least, Rose Herceg. Rose Herceg is Chief Strategy Officer for WPP, Australia and New Zealand, and there are a few people in Australia with a deeper and more a deeper knowledge which translates to creativity in the Australian media environment. So please welcome them all. Simon, take us through the thinking behind, because I think what I want to get to in a lot of this is what's the mood? Where are the landmines in terms of the community? And America's a very different place from us. But I think it would be very interesting for us just to hear the thinking, the research that went on, and how it all ended up.
Sure, thanks, Norman. Yeah, I'll just give you a quick kind of broad strokes recap of how we approached it. So our client is the Ad Council, the Pereira O'Dell, and if anyone doesn't know who they are, they're basically responsible for all of the public service announcements that go on in America. So when the COVID-19 vaccines became available, they approached us to create a campaign to encourage people to take it. The team who worked on it, I was working from here, my ECD in San Francisco, Jason Apoliski, and PJ Pereira, our founder in New York. So we were all over the world working, every morning we'd chat, we'd work and then connect every day. So we had basically a 24-hour work cycle going because we had to work fast. Bit of context around like when this happened. It was December 2020. It was post-election. America had never been more polarized or divided. There was misinformation, rampant. The virus was spreading everywhere. And a lot of people were actually, more scared of the vaccines than the virus itself. So the Ad Council showed us some research, and they found that only 30% of Americans at that point wanted to take the vaccine. 20% would not take the vaccine, no matter what you said. And then we had this 50% chunk in the middle, which we called the movable middle. They were vaccine hesitant, but they were open to learn more. So, we had this, big chunk, 160 million people. And of that, there were thousands of different subgroups. And we had to create this umbrella campaign to really speak to this diverse, fragmented group. We put a few different lines and thinking into the research, but anything that pushed the vaccine or told people to get the vaccine was actually backfired, and people kind of shut down. And that was, and that's how we got to It's Up to You, because inherently is choice, and it's respecting people's choice and that freedom, and giving them that autonomy and liberty, which is very, very important, when it comes to a vaccine. So basically, we took this, we kind of executed in 3 rough phases. The first was educational. And part of that was really normalizing questions. We didn't want to make anyone feel bad for being hesitant about it. I think that's really, really important. So we created a spot and a whole integrated campaign about, the common questions that people have about the vaccine, and all the answers, very clear answers on a website to all of those questions. The second phase was about creating confidence through influence. And again, there was a large range of content created, from working with Obama, Bush, Clinton, and Jimmy Carter to do 2 spots, and one in which they actually had the vaccine, all the way down to the community level. So we engaged trusted messengers, and we had toolkits available, free toolkits on the site. So doctors and faith leaders and community leaders could go into their own communities and speak on that level. So it was a very multifaceted approach. And the third phase was all about emotion, the why. Why should we get vaccinated? And that ranged in content from working with Willie Nelson and the 13 major sports leagues to create a spot about getting back to sports. We worked with Sesame Street to create a PSA and a song. And we even ended up working with the American Country Music Awards, because as the campaign was evolving, we found that conservatives had actually the highest levels of hesitancy. So that's why we engaged country music artists and did spots to speak to them. And even the messaging at the end of our spots evolved from, pushing people to the website to get answers to rather speaking to their doctor, because we knew that a lot of these people wouldn't actually trust what you saw online. And we knew that their doctor was probably that only person in their life who could give them the information they needed, and it actually might have an effect. So all in all, we had about 300 partners, brand partners, media partners, tech platforms, agencies, who all took the DNA of this campaign we created and went and made their own things and their own content that spoke authentically to their audiences, but always laddered back up to It's Up to You. And I think having that united kind of party line at the top that everything came back to was really important. We also had $500 million of donated media, making it the largest public health campaign in US history. And today, in July, almost 60% of the American population over 18 are vaccinated. And in all the major cities, that number's over 70%. Obviously, there's still more work to do, especially in the South and the middle states in America. And that's actually continuing to happen. This is continuing to evolve. But that's basically how we approached it and how we got those results.
And have you got any sense, Simon, of the impact of the campaign versus just the ongoing epidemic in America, which has been pretty dreadful? In other words, did you research the impact of the campaign on the uptake of the vaccine?
Yeah, we found that, the numbers I have are from March, but by late March, when we started in February, vaccine hesitancy was down 42%. So just, from starting with that number of 30% of Americans only, willing to get vaccinated at the beginning, and now almost, 60% above 18, it shows that, all of these different multifaceted approaches are working. And you have to think there's the people are affected by so many different touch points. So, you know, someone might see, you know, a sports fan might see that one spot, and they're also a parent and they might see the Sesame Street spot. And then they also, you know, miss going out with their friends and might see the Budweiser. So everything really complemented each other.
And the core thing about "it's up to you," that reads as respecting American individualism. But you know, you're Australian and you live here. How much does that apply here as an overarching concept, do you think?
I think that really like leaning into choice is important. I think when you look at some of the current campaigns here, when you lean into fear, the thing with fear is it paralyzes, and the people who are on the fence about getting it shut down. So I think it's all about like keeping that line of communication and bringing choice into it. And I think that that could be a potential way forward when speaking to people. Once everyone who wants the vaccine has the vaccine, that group left over, that could be part of the campaign, or the way we speak to people.
Yeah, and what sits behind this is that, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, probably hesitancy has gone down a lot just because of fear in many ways. But there will be a mopping up to do, which we'll come back to later. I mean, this conversation is not all about vaccination. We're going to get into more. But Julie, you've been following the American campaign and have some views on it and what we can learn from it or not, as the case may be.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm acknowledging Darug country where I'm coming from today, and elders past, present and future. So absolutely, I love this campaign because it has some elements we know from vaccination behavioural science that are important. So first of all, it's conversant with the values of the audience, knowing that choice was important, that people had suffered from a lack of choice, and that was creating partisan divisions in US society in particular, more so there than for us in Australia. And so a message that's centred on choice, it's up to you, is a really smart idea. Having multiple leaders who represent different sides of politics. So you had the former US presidents from both sides of politics in those ad campaigns. Addressing people's questions was essential because there were a lot of genuine, important, right questions to be asking. And there are plenty of people who are at the beginning of a vaccination program are just not quite sure about the vaccines because they're new, and that's normal. And we've seen that with vaccination programs in the past, like the HPV vaccination program. And as people get used to the idea, they become more confident over time. So we will see that in the future as well. It created social norms around vaccination because it had influencers and community leaders heading up those messages across diverse platforms. And obviously you would have heavily evaluated what you were doing and using that information to refine the messages and improve them as you went, which is always essential. And it's interesting, Simon, that you didn't focus on appeals to fear at all, because I know that this can be a bit of a debate with vaccination campaigns. And certainly the science on using fear appeals with vaccination is quite mixed. It can improve intentions to vaccinate among some people if they have what we call response efficacy. They know how to get the vaccine, where and when. They have supply. But if people are a bit against vaccination or they don't have that response efficacy, then people can get angry. That creates reactants and they can be more likely to reject the message. So appeals to fear need to be thought out really carefully and planned in consultation with the target audiences. But certainly values are at the heart of campaign messages, and the other values that are relevant potentially for us are values around care for others and protection of others and protection of ourselves. And also, of course, choice is also important, particularly to certain sectors of Australian society.
And Julie, people misunderstand the reason behind that ad with the actor having trouble breathing the other day. That wasn't a vaccine ad. People think it was.
Primarily it wasn't. So it was created some time ago and it was put on ice, ready for an outbreak. And that was intended to be used when there was an outbreak and they needed people to be willing to lock down. So as a kind of lockdown reinforcement message, you know, it was probably okay. The unfortunate thing was that it came out the same day as our Arm Yourself message came out, and people have misunderstood it as primarily a get vaccinated campaign, which is not. That's the third message, which is book a vaccine. So I think that nuance was lost there, and you've seen the reactants already, people getting angry that they're manipulated into getting vaccinated when they can't access the vaccine easily, particularly for young people.
And before I come to Rose, the curveball that we've had in Australia, which they didn't have in the United States because they were relying dominantly on the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, is the curveball we've had of the problems with the Astra vaccine. How's that? I might actually ask Simon that very quickly. If you'd had that curveball, what would you have done in the US campaign? Because originally you'd thought about there might be a problem. There could be an unexpected problem arising with the vaccines.
I mean, seeing what happened here with the back and forth, it's okay, it's not okay, definitely was not a great strategy. I think that if that had happened in America, I think we would have kind of reverted back to our kind of first phase, talking about those questions, really leaning into being like, look, there's a lot of confusion about the AstraZeneca campaign. Let's talk about it. And I would actually make that a focal point and create a bunch of toolkits and focus on how we can clear the air around that to just assuage people's fears. I
agree with that. The different messages have been risk-based, benefit-based messages, so they've been scientifically appropriate, and they've been done with the safety of Australians front of mind. It's just that the frequency of change is now really creating uncertainty for people whether they can get the vaccine, and that's been a real challenge for us, and I agree. In fact, a lot of us have been doing multiple webinars with different sectors. My colleagues in Melbourne in particular, Margie Danch and Jess Kaufman, have been doing a lot of webinars, us in Sydney as well, around the vaccination and the sort of the technical part of it, the vaccinology, explaining the risk-benefit issues, the effectiveness issues, and trying to help people work with their own sectors to address the hesitancy that's inevitably there, and also share the behavioural science on how to overcome that in this kind of volatile environment.
Rose, give us your take. This is a roller coaster we're on. I mean, only a month ago we had, just as an example, we had vaccine hesitancy. Now we've got queues, people lining up for it. Circumstances change. We're turning on a dime here frequently. Give us a sense of your mood of the nation and the challenge for marketers to not just communicate social marketing messages like vaccination, but brand marketing, the traditional marketing.
Sure. So Aussies are all over the place, right? So when you look at the mood of our nation, they've got so many different people coming at them: local government, state government, federal government, marketers, brands, banks, telcos, you name it. It's a free-for-all. And what tends to happen with Australians when we're coming at them with 85,000 different messages is they just shut out to everything. They are over it. They're exhausted. They're exhausted with federal versus state government. They're exhausted with state versus local government. They're exhausted with turf wars of Victoria versus New South Wales. They're exhausted with telcos telling them they're there for them. They're exhausted with banks telling them, tell us if you need to pause your home loan. I think what we're seeing in all the market research about the mood of this nation is very simple. If you're going to bother communicating with me, be very clear about what you're going to communicate, or shut up. And there's a lesson in there for all of us. Speak with clarity, have a clarion voice, know what your message is. If you don't have anything to say, then don't speak. And the thing about, don't speak unless you can improve upon the silence, a lot of Aussies have taken that to heart. And I think the mood of this nation is we want to hear clarion messages that make sense, that are thoughtful, that are direct, And if you can't do that, then don't do anything. So that's what I'm saying, Norman, in terms of all the research about the mood of this country.
So how does that translate into messaging when you want to keep, for example, your brand alive in a marketplace which is changing this much? Go dark and wait until all the dust settles, which might not be to 2022, or be driven by research, or what? I mean, you can imagine, we've been talking a lot about fear here, fear in the community. There's probably fear amongst clients and agencies.
There's huge fear amongst all different clients at all different levels. I think what we're telling our clients and the advice that we're giving is be very clear about what benefit your brand or your business gives to the community. Don't use platitudes. Don't speak in generalities. If you've got a really important service that you provide, and of course the supermarkets have done incredibly well because what they're doing is incredibly valuable. We all need to shop, we all need to eat. They've done a very good job of being very clear about what their message is. So we're not saying to anybody go dark. What we are saying is if you're taking up valuable airspace and you're putting your brand out into the community, whatever media channel you select, just be very clear about what you're doing and what you're offering. And keep, and this is going to sound odd to say this, and keep a sense of humor about it. We need to remember that there is a humanity to everything every Australian is going through. People are uncertain, people are unsure, people live in homes, they don't know whether they're safe or not. There is a reality to not using the buzzword bingo of a category, being really clear, using some human language. And so we say to our clients, the banks, the telcos, the retailers, the tech businesses, connect with Aussies at a really human level. Figure out what services you provide that they really need, or products, and give it to them in a very thoroughly Australian way. And those brands that are doing incredibly well. And so going dark isn't the answer. Figuring out how you can be of service during this time and what your company or brand can offer, that's the answer for pretty much every brand.
And does the channel mix change in the current environment?
It does. I mean, look at the out-of-home businesses. The out-of-home digital media businesses have had to change kind of a lot in the last 18 months because we're just simply not out in the world. So finding your target audience has never been more important. You know, CRM, EDMs, through a screen, through an email that we all are getting thousands of a day, through social channels. The brands that are really applying the kind of media that happens to you direct, one-to-one, are cleaning up. They're doing incredibly well. Mass marketing, mass media, not so much, but then there are galvanizing things, state of origin, soon the Olympics in Tokyo. There are moments where we're watching television. Hate to say it, but Married at First Sight, it still rated its socks off. So does Ninja Warrior. So it's really understanding where the audiences are and how to connect through them, and understanding what I would call charming media. How do you charm and disarm using the media channel or the media selection? We're advising our clients to relook at all of their media plans and to figure out where their audiences are and then go there.
Simon, how comment on that?
Sorry, and can you just kind of ask specifically what?
So that approach, which is really probably super careful about your messaging now and really think hard about the channels, which people do all the time, but they feel as if they're treading on eggshells.
No, I totally agree with Rose. To your first point, and I think what we tried to do was have a single unifying message that everyone talked about and talked to, that was clear, versus creating a lot of noise and confusion with multiple campaigns.
And what about this issue of being funny? Because some people say, oh, that's where we fear to tread, and you can see the fear sometimes in some public service announcements around this area. They're probably desperate to be funny, but they think, God, this could really blow back in my face.
I think there's, it's a fine line, but if you look at campaigns like New Zealand and what they did and how they kept it really lighthearted and upbeat and positive, and sure, there were some funny moments in there. It's not, we're not talking like, laugh out loud slapstick stuff, but really just, again, like disarming people, relaxing people, and opening them up to that conversation. So I think there's definitely a role for that. And especially in the Australian market, I think people are very open to seeing content that is tonally in that same world as that New Zealand campaign.
Can I remind you in the audience to put in your questions and comments into the Q&A box, and we'll get to them. I want to get what you want right now, in fact, with Julie. But Julie, I noticed you nodding while Rose was talking there. What were you nodding at?
Look, I was reflecting actually, because I was wondering, well, have I been clear enough? I've done 270 media interviews since the beginning of last year. And when you know too much, it's harder to be crystal clear with the messages. If I say the vaccine is safe, I know that there are tiny risks that can be serious. So I'm not comfortable doing that. So I'll always qualify it. So I was kind of identifying with the challenge, but also the importance of that. And we need that now. We really do need a bit of a reset with our vaccine comms at the moment, because we've got so many different messages, people pulling in different directions, different programmatic recommendations based on risk issues and balances. And we need all the help we can get.
There's a question here for you, Julie, from one of the participants in the audience, is what data do you have that might illuminate marketing to the under 40s, messaging to the under 40s, particularly at a time where they can't get access to the vaccine and they feel vulnerable? What's your data telling you about the under 40s?
It'd probably be for the under 40s, a bit of a get ready message. And reflecting on what Simon was saying about the US campaign and giving people tailored education, finding out what their biggest dilemmas and concerns are across diverse communities of young people, where they're getting their messages, how they're consuming their news, because the news cycle is influencing the way we think about vaccination, and tailoring the education to that, but also overall this get ready. So I note that fear campaign, which was probably not so well placed at the moment because people are anxious already, and certainly with the Sydney lockdown when it was launched on Monday. So maybe have there's a book your vaccine message. Well, some people can do that, but maybe others can't just yet, or there's a huge wait. But there could be some kind of, get prepared for vaccination kind of message with a pro-social message in there, because we know that young people do perceive themselves to be at lower risk from COVID-19, partly because that's factual. They are, in terms of proportions, slightly a lot lower risk of dying from COVID-19 than older people, but they can still potentially, in fact, they're the ones who spread it to others predominantly. So they need the ones in ICU at the moment. Yep. And so that pro-social, protect others, get ready to be vaccinated message is going to be very important for the under 40s.
So one thing I want to ask you all here is a thought that I've had for now over a year, which is, you saw the Victorian, and I'm wondering how applicable it is to general marketing when you're talking about brands and so on. So what you saw in Victoria in the second wave, and you're now seeing it in the second wave in New South Wales, because this is the second wave in New South Wales, is that you get spread into communities which tend to be disadvantaged, but tend not to be a bit disconnected from the dominant Anglo culture. And they really messed it up in Victoria during the beginning of the second wave. They were not communicating well to the people of the northwestern corridor, northern and western suburbs. And in fact, what they had to do was go almost like a guerrilla action, which is go into communities, work with communities, get community leaders mobilized and so on. And here we are in Sydney, going down into the southwestern suburbs, where you've got similar issues with people whose English is not the first language, tend to be poorer than average, working all over the city and needing that income. And again, a very dominant Anglo culture trying to communicate with them rather than community development. But I just wonder whether it's also a missed opportunity for marketers in general. Are we too broad in our marketing approach and not micro enough in our targeting, not just in terms of channels, but in terms of messaging? So I might come to you first on that, Simon, then go to Rose.
Yeah, I mean, I think we experienced this firsthand because we went into a lot of communities disproportionately affected by COVID-19, Hispanic communities, Black communities. And we've actually translated, our message into multiple languages, and obviously engaged with community leaders as how best to speak to that specific community in ways that they would understand, because everyone has different motivations and different fears about the vaccines. We need to hone in what are those motivations and how do we just lock into those and calm those fears.
And just the question before we move on then is, because Nadia Chase is asking just this question as well, and did you develop strategies that you thought worked in all communities? Did you manage to pull out the focus, or really you had to work through the individual communities?
You can't do a one-size-fits-all campaign anymore. Like you really, we knew that each piece of content we created, we were capturing different markets. And so it was definitely necessary to create those micro kind of strategies and to go into those communities, because you can't expect to have like one message that resonates with everyone.
Rose, broadening out beyond COVID.
Yeah, this is such a big thing for me. I'm so passionate about this issue because I'm one of them. I'm one of the multicultural Australians. Look, there are 217 nationalities in Australia. 1 in 3 Australians wasn't born in Australia. Half the country speaks a language other than English at home. I'm one of them. I only speak English in the workplace. And if I look at the way you got to communicate to this audience, and I look at my own, there are several 100,000 Croats, Croatians and Bosnians that live in Australia. If I look at, say, my mum is a person who used to run the local radio for the Croatian community. For want of a better word, she was the John Laws of the Croatian community. Every single community in this country has its own radio program. It has its own newspaper. It has its own opportunities or groups on social media. It really does things in a particular way, and it's not that hard to find who those community leaders are and how to accurately, and this is really critical, accurately translate not just into language but into dialect. It's so important. I could not be more passionate about this. There are experts in the community, but the government needs to find them and seek them out. And I think there's a bit of a sense of we'll just do it roughly the same way for all the different migrant communities. Nothing could be further from the truth. And so I think this is an area where if government could get better advice and seek better expertise, they would have found that even in southwest Sydney, particularly in Fairfield and the suburbs there, what they would be getting is much better advice on how to get to the very people where English is a second language.
But what about...
Can I make a point there? Sorry to interrupt. That the government may well be getting good advice, but they've also got to be able to listen to that advice. And I know that, those of us who work in this field have said again and again, and this really highlights what Rose said, that the communication can't be one way and just broadcast. It has to be two-way. And that means listening and understanding the communities and what's important to them, particularly for some of those communities who suffered injustices last year. How can we rebuild trust? And that communication with culturally, linguistically diverse communities needs to be adequately resourced, because community leaders have been asked again and again to translate, to share, to be nodes of influence with their communities for free. And a lot of them are doing it tough financially. So that's one thing I've heard about the importance of resourcing that communication and the very engaged and two-way communication that's manifested in multiple ways.
So Julie, you talk about trust there, and there's a question from Alan Fitzpatrick, which is, and by the way, please keep your questions coming into the question and answer box. How important is community trust in the government as a source of public health information and advice? And trust in whom, in a sense, when you talk about trust? It's
absolutely foundational to a national willingness to be vaccinated. And once there's trust in a pandemic is informed by people's confidence in the government, their sense that the messages are consistent, that the person communicating has good faith and wants the best for them and has empathy and competence in their objectivity. But you can lose trust, like it arrives on foot and leaves on horseback. And then you've got to think about the task of rebuilding it. So prioritising the maintenance of trust and thinking deeply about what that actually means in practice is absolutely essential. And two-way communication will get you a long way, along with genuine respect for the communities that you're talking with. But it's absolutely foundational. And if you look at countries where there are low vaccination intentions, Poland, France, there are real issues with trusting government around vaccination historically in those countries.
Simon, how much did you find, so that's one level, which is trust from communities to government. But then if you do engage successfully with community leaders, they need trust and they need cut through with their communities. And Melanie Darmody's just asked an interesting point, which is that they don't necessarily always get cut through to their communities through no fault of anybody, really. How did you have to deal with that issue in terms of making sure that the people you were communicating with were getting cut through to the community they were trying to communicate with in that micro sense?
To be honest, not necessarily. I think that, again, what we tried to do was bring in that multifaceted approach around communities. So not only did we have leaders going out and speaking to people, but we had, local news stations talking about the vaccine. Just again, being in their kind of world, in their peripheral, and coming at them with different in different mediums. But I do know that one thing we did face at the beginning, the Black community in America has a huge mistrust with vaccines. Historically, there have been a lot of issues. And so it was really important for us to work with Black agencies to talk about that and to give them the reins to speak on that issue and enable that trust through their communities.
Do you have a comment on that, Rose?
Look, I think, again, it all goes back to finding people who know what they're talking about, right? Real expertise, getting them to be really advising in the right way. I think across the board, what we find more and more with Multicultural Australia is that they're very good actually connecting with their community. They're very, very good at it. And we could take a lesson from their book about how they go about it. I think Julie is right. They don't get the budget to do it. They're asked to do it gratis. They're asked to do it as a favour. That has to stop, right? This is a really important thing. If you can mobilise them in the right way, they will do all of the heavy lifting for you. They will really get in, roll up their sleeves and make it happen, particularly church groups, churches, synagogues, mosques. This is an incredibly powerful part of Australian multiculturalism, and I've never understood why those places in particular should be places where our government is seeking the help of the faith-based communities to get these messages out, because that is a really culminating place. So I just think we need to be better at it, to be honest. And I often worry that we're sitting with the rule book when it comes to multicultural communication that's like 40 years old. This would have been an opportunity for this country to rewrite the rules, to lead the charge, and to really set the pace for how to get messages inside communities in a very clever way.
I just want to change tack a little bit, but stay with you, Rose. Sanjana Dudas asked, how do you balance choice with, it's a really good question. I'll ask you as a marketer and then I'll move to Julie. How do you balance choice with messages that are pro-vaccine? Because the idea here is you're spending money to get people to bear their arms.
Sure. Well, I think the way you do it is, again, the very clever storytelling. I mean, I love what the French campaign is doing. I mean, the French are out there talking about how one of the good reasons to get vaccinated is that you can return to what the French do best. They have fun, they go out, they go to restaurants, they live. Australians live outside. Australians love to go to restaurants. Australians love to go to pubs and bars and to each other's houses. We are an outdoor nation. I think the way to balance that is to get people to get motivated about what it was like 18 months ago. I mean, I have forgotten myself what it's like to frock up, put on a pair of heels, fix my hair, and go out to a lovely restaurant. Or just wander.
It's ages since I've worn a frock.
But I've forgotten what it's like to spontaneously stop inside a bar and have a drink and have a great something on the menu. And I think the way to balance it is to get people to remember what it's like to be part of the world, and they will then choose that life. If we told every Australian right now that they would not be able to travel overseas, everybody would get a vaccine, right? We are the most well-traveled people in the known universe by tyranny of distance. If the message was, you won't get to go anywhere anymore, everybody would line up, because this country wants to visit its family back in other countries around the world.
So Julie, the point there from Rose is you balance your choices in the message. That's what she's saying really, isn't it?
Yeah, in that case, you're using the concept of choice to go about things that you used to do. And this will be particularly salient for the under 40s as well, who are more likely to travel. choice to be able to hug each other, choice to be able to attend a family wedding without the threat of it being closed down. All of those things are going to be powerful messages in the promise of vaccination. And I think the person asking that question had a really important point there, that in some areas of our vaccine policy, we reduce choice quite a bit. For example, no jab, no pay and play. And I note that the Prime Minister last year said we will not make mandatory COVID-19 vaccine mandatory. It could end up being that there are some requirements for travel or for certain occupations where people are put at greater risk. But when you're still getting a population on board, you're still getting them access to vaccination, you're still answering their questions and concerns, it's very important that you don't take away a sense that people have a choice. You need to give them a chance to voluntarily accept vaccination by and large, with the exception of certain risk circumstances like quarantine workers, border workers. So we've done a lot of work with hesitant parents where we think about this, because choice is really important to parents who are hesitant about vaccinating their children. And we came upon some ways of talking about this, which were that for parents, there is a choice to be made. Here are the options, and here are the risks and benefits of each of those options. And let's help bring for you what's important, and remind you also of the implications of your choice for the health of other people. So it's a pretty softly approach. It's not the only approach, but it's a good one when people are concerned and where choice is important to them. And there may be circumstances in which you want to also maybe incentivize people to vaccinate, and that might tip some of those more hesitant people over slightly more. We'll see lots of different approaches.
I just jumped in and say, to Rose and Julie's point, when we were first testing that line, it's up to you, we would always combine it with images of human connection, those things that people want to get back to. So being in a restaurant, hugging your grandmother, being in a packed sports stadium. The choice is still there, but that incentive of life as we used to, the life we used to live, we felt would be enough to push people to learn more and then get vaccinated.
So this is a problem for brands as well as the vaccination program, which is negative information might come out about your product, or there's misinformation about vaccination in general. My approach to this, which is probably wrong, but my approach to this is to kind of ignore it, to not give it fuel. If somebody wants to say that 5G caused COVID-19, well, feel free, but I'm relying on the sense of Australians, so I don't give it oxygen. But maybe that's the wrong thing to do. Should we be down in the trenches fighting misinformation? And one of the questions here is, using social media more intelligently and so on. But the high level question is, should we be in the trenches picking up every piece of information and jumping on it? Simon, what did you do?
So not every piece. There are obviously some pieces that seem so wild and out there that you don't want to give them oxygen. But the ones that are bubbling to the top, that obviously are gaining more speed with and potentially resonating with more people, those are questions you shouldn't be afraid of. We created lots of small social pieces that targeted new questions as they came up. Does the COVID-19 vaccine affect fertility? And we had answers on that. And so as new concerns came up, as long as they were ones that were valid in terms of like how many people actually were kind of on board with them, we didn't shy away. And we gave them, here's the information, you're talking about this, here's why it's not true. And again, having that discussion, not shutting those people down, but keeping that dialogue open. And not saying that like you're like that's stupid to believe, or that's wrong, or you're an idiot. That's again just going to shut people down.
Julie?
Yeah, this is a really vexing one, because we used to say to people, don't do this myth busting thing where you start with the myth and then give people a whole lot of information afterwards, because they'll just remember the myth. and the negation tag, as we call it, will fall off with time. And we actually did an experiment with this, and emerging evidence is showing it's actually okay to do that as long as you give the corrective information afterwards. So the science is evolving on this, but you have to be discerning about when you respond to misinformation. You know, it's like whack-a-mole, like you'll end up just jumping on all of the misinformation and you'll never devote time to what might be really important if you're a campaign planner, for example, or a vaccination program manager. But our advice around dealing with misinformation is ask yourself, is it being shared a lot? Is it potentially affecting people's behaviour? Is it, and then if it is, then you prepare people, like you kind of, you immunise them psychologically by saying, you might hear people say that 5G is the cause of, COVID-19. Well, here are the facts, and you give them the response to that. Early factual communication, so you get in with that, shaping people's knowledge early before it's too cemented. Don't feed the trolls and use trusted spokespeople.
Rose, what's your view of this?
I think, interestingly enough, I think this is where humour can be a fantastic weapon for the nutty stuff. So if a nutty thing takes on a life of its own, I have seen some beautiful ways to dispense with truly dangerous misinformation and not give it any oxygen. The way that we look at this with a lot of our clients as well is if it does take on a life of its own, we need to shift the conversation someplace else. Nothing works as well as really good humour. Interestingly enough, one would not think that, but we've seen this several times where we've been able to kind of laugh at it in a way that isn't insulting, in a way that isn't cruel, to expose the ridiculousness of the allegation and the misinformation. But, I must say, I think if it's not getting any traction, it doesn't even take the energy to respond to it. You've got to let it go. You've got to let it die. And what I have found, oftentimes people confuse one for the other. So that's where judgment comes into it, right? What do you let go? What do you let go through to the keeper? And what do you actually take a cricket bat to? And that's the tricky one here, in that I think most people get that wrong, and that's when problems come. But, plenty of too little time, right, that we have on our hands right now. And what do you actually kick back at? You've got to really pick your battles.
What role should brands play in getting people vaccinated?
I think a lot more than what they currently are. I think they have a huge role to play. I think that, airlines, banks, telcos, all the big players have a role to say, listen, you're a customer of ours. We service you. You patronise us. You're a customer of ours. We think that if we all work together, we can get this country vaccinated. We can get immunity, herd immunity happening, and we can get on with life. I think they do have a role to play. For no other reason than they make a lot of money out of Australians. And as community service, they need to give something back. Again, I think we're seeing cases from around the world, examples from around the world that are really effective. But again, if you look at travel, if you look at the major carriers, if you look at Qantas, how they can get involved, what they're already doing, travel is such a big part of Australian life. Having all of these guys step up and take responsibility for helping, I think, is key, and I think it's welcomed. I think we need it.
Julie?
So if you're meaning, Norman, in terms of providing incentives, like the
That's
the
part
donuts,
of it, yes. Yeah.
the donuts and the beers. Well, as a public health person, I'd say that we certainly welcome companies getting involved as long as it's legal, and encouraging people with a small incentive. There is evidence that incentives work with improving vaccination rates. They have to be thought out carefully. But to have products that can cause a lot of harm as part of your incentive is another question. So junk food and alcohol can cause a lot of harm in our society. It's also a pleasurable, fun part of living. But is it part of a public health campaign, which is what vaccination is about? My answer would be no. So, free beers for your vaccine, no. Find another product that will reach that similar audience that's a bit healthier. In terms of companies getting involved in vaccination, that's crucial. They have a huge role to play. they really pivoted very well. Some of our CEOs were thinking right on the front foot last year around COVID, and they can do that with vaccination, eventually providing on-site access to vaccination, because again, access is so important. Encouraging their workers, maybe providing incentives, or there's many different ways in which companies can encourage vaccination of their staff.
Simon, I mean, the incentives have been huge in the United States because you've seen a plateauing of the vaccination rate.
Exactly. I think that's the point of when you want to bring them out. I mean, there was in Ohio, there was a lottery where they would, I think it was $1 million every week. I can't remember if that was the exact amount, but they were giving this large amount of money to people, and they were in the running if they got vaccinated. People were giving, schools were giving scholarships. So I think that when the time
did they work? Is there any evidence they worked?
I think they did, yeah. I think those states really saw an uptick in vaccinations. So again, like when you've reached all the people who want the vaccine, who have gotten it, and you have the stragglers, and you're understanding why they're waiting, then some of those incentives will again help narrow down the rest, and then you can continue tailoring messages and changing tact based on who's left until you reach that herd immunity.
Oh, sorry, Julie, you want to...
Yeah, you just reminded me of a really interesting experiment in the US where they said, we're going to put you into a lottery, and it'll be a higher chance lottery, and if you win, the way you claim your prize is that you are vaccinated. If you're not vaccinated, you're disqualified from the lottery. So what they played on was this emotion of anticipated regret, which is the regret we anticipate from our actions now into the future. And these behavioural scientists in the US, led by Kathy Milkman, were finding that this was one effective way. The incentive doesn't have to be massive to encourage people to vaccinate, regardless of how you present that incentive.
So is that academic speak for FOMO?
No, it's anticipated regret apparently, but maybe Norman, that is another psychological mechanism we're yet to identify.
FOMO. I want to know where we go from here. I mean, it's very hard to predict the future, but we've been on a sufficient roller coaster. We know what's going to happen. We are going to see more lockdowns. We'll see new variants. It's going to be a while before we have enough supply in to vaccinate people. We'll probably get a big surge of people wanting to have vaccine to begin with as soon as supply is available, but then we will probably see a tailing off just like everybody else. But I want to get a sense of the mood of the country, what you're anticipating going to happen. One person on the question list, I talked about the word apathy. We're just going to get fed up and numb to it all and throw up our hands and just say, let it rip. I mean, what's your crystal ball here in terms of Australia and Australians and all their diversity moving forward? Rose?
Well, interestingly, what I've loved about this country is that there've been more registrations of new business in the last 18 months than in the last 30 years in one hit. In other words, the entrepreneurial spirit has really been awakened, and I go against a lot of the talk about apathy or playing by the rules, because I think what Aussies have seen is that they don't want to be at the mercy of government. They don't want to be at the mercy of their boss, where they might lose their job. They want to take more control of their life, their livelihood, and their future. And there is this incredible positivity to that. And to a lot of people who never thought that they would be entrepreneurs, never thought that they would be self-employed, looking at an opportunity to take what is a skill or a side hustle and turn it into a legitimate business. And I get thrilled. I've had more emails from would-be entrepreneurs in the last 12 months than I have ever had in my life as somebody who started several businesses and sold them. From the most unlikely people right across the board, all different ages, all different income brackets, all different nationalities. I actually think this pandemic and what it has done for this country in terms of people taking more control over their future and their future destiny is thrilling. And I'm not of the mind of the hesitancy or the nervousness. I think people have gone entirely the other way, and I think that's a great thing. So that if I were to do a prediction, I think 2 years from now, we're going to see the next brigade of Atlassian and other incredible startups that come out of Australia, because people have decided that, you know, if necessity is the mother of all invention, then take control of your life, because look what happens when you don't.
Simon?
Yeah, no, I think that, you know, in terms of like moving forward, I'm thinking of it as more of from a brand view and more of a marketing view, but making sure that all brands and anyone who's out there speaks, you know, along a similar party line, cuts that confusion, and really gets involved in getting into the community and speaking to people, again, creating dialogue, kind of taking everything that's happened so far, you know, with the vaccine program, with the vaccine advertising, and wiping, like creating a new slate, starting fresh, and just being very clear so that we can get enough people, you know, on board and vaccinated to then move forward. I think, you know, Australians, you can see now we're all in lockdown. We're quite compliant, you know, when you know, compared to Americans. And I think, you know, we do want to help each other out. That whole we're all in this together mindset rings true. We just want the government, and we just want everything else to just lay it out simply, and say, like, this is how we're going to do it, and this is when we're going to get over it, and this is when we're going to get back to life.
Julie?
Yeah, for all we've been through with our supply issues, I've got great optimism that we can do this, because we did really well last year with pandemic control and public cooperation and willingness. We're motivated. The outbreaks will keep motivating us to vaccinate. We'll need very high coverage to control COVID and keep the suppression happening, even though we may end up, if we open the borders more, having more COVID cases, like you talk about, Norman, this sort of the flu of the future. Although I don't want to minimise flu either, but we'll need to throw everything we can at it. I reckon we can get to 85% of eligible adults vaccinated, but we'll need to do a whole lot of things to get us there, and it will, I hope I'm wrong, but it won't happen till next year. And we'll need to make sure that access is very easy, multiple points of delivery, in-reach services for the homebound, easier, convenient services, on-site vaccination with businesses and other locations. We'll need probably incentives to some degree if a government decides that that's something it's willing to do. We'll need, in some cases, to have requirements. Now, they may not be a requirement to vaccinate, because requirements simply to provide documentation of your vaccination or an exemption can be just as effective in getting high coverage. So we need to think in nuanced ways about those more complex issues around mandatory vaccination. But we can get there, and I'm very hopeful, because we all want to get out of the situation we're in now, particularly from here in Sydney in a long lockdown.
So, optimistic views of the future, when people in Sydney and Melbourne are probably not feeling that optimistic at the moment, or feeling a bit ground down, but a way to lift you out. Some really useful comments there about brands and messaging, and the public health messaging also moving forwards, and social marketing a very important way of moving forward. On behalf of Tonic Media Network, let me thank you all for joining me. Please join me in thanking our panel, Rose Herceg, Julie Leask, and Simon Friedlander. We'll have a copy of this, a recording of this available to people who wish to see it. And I'd like to thank our producers, Claire Hayes, as well. Have a good day and a good weekend, under lockdown or not. Bye for now.